Clean that up and don't speak. The words landed flat, sharp, like something rehearsed too many times to carry any doubt. Naomi Carter didn't look up right away. The cloth in her hand moved in slow, steady circles across the glass table, catching the reflection of the ceiling lights, cold, white, unforgiving. Around her, 12 people sat in silence, tailored suits, polished shoes, watches that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. No one stopped him. No one corrected him. They just watched. Richard Hale stood at the head of the table, one hand resting casually on the back of a leather chair, the other flipping through a stack of documents like he owned not just the company, but the air in the room. "You're here to clean," he added, not even looking at her this time. "So clean. That's all." Naomi's hand paused for half a second. Not enough for anyone to notice. Except maybe the reflection. In the glass, her face looked calm. Too calm. She resumed wiping, the faint scent of industrial cleaner rising into the chilled air, cutting through the subtle cologne and espresso. Somewhere behind her, a chair shifted. Someone cleared their throat, then thought better of it. The room held its breath without admitting it was doing so. Richard continued, voice smooth, practiced, confident in the way only someone unchallenged for too long could be. "Now, if everyone is ready, we'll finalize the agreement. This closes the deal at $42 million. Clean, efficient, and exactly how we like it." A few heads nodded. Pens clicked open. Pages turned. Naomi stepped to the side, folding the cloth once, then again, her fingers precise, controlled. She should have walked out. That would have been easier. Invisible in, invisible out. That was the rule. That was how you kept your job. But something in the stack of papers on the table caught her eye. Not the bold headings or the signature lines. Something smaller. A line buried halfway down the page. Her gaze lingered for just a second too long. Then she looked away. Then back again. The room moved on without her, voices low, confident, already celebrating something that hadn't been signed yet. Richard picked up his pen. Silver. Heavy. He rolled it once between his fingers, then positioned it over the final page. Naomi took a breath. Not deep. Not dramatic. Just enough. Her shoes made almost no sound against the marble as she stepped closer to the table. No one noticed at first. Why would they? She was just the cleaner. Just background. Just movement in the corner of the eye. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Sir, that clause doesn't protect you." The pen stopped midair. Not dropped. Not shaken. Just paused. For a second, no one reacted. Like the room needed to process where the sound had come from. Then a few heads turned. Slowly, one by one, toward her. Richard didn't look up immediately. He kept his eyes on the paper, as if the interruption hadn't earned his attention yet. "Excuse me," he said finally, calm, but thinner now. Naomi didn't move. Didn't shrink. "Page 14, she said, her tone steady, almost clinical. "Second paragraph. It transfers all post-merger liability to your side. If anything goes wrong, you absorb the loss." A soft laugh broke from somewhere near the far end of the table. Another followed. Not cruel, just dismissive. "Easy. She reads contracts now?" someone murmured. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't need to. The room had already decided who she was. Or who she wasn't. Richard finally lifted his gaze. His eyes landed on her like a weight, measured, unimpressed. He studied her for a moment. Uniform slightly worn, name tag tilted, hands still faintly damp from cleaning solution. Then he gave a small, almost amused exhale. "And you are?" he asked. Naomi met his eyes. Not challenging. Not apologizing. Just present. "Naomi," she said. A beat. Then his lips curved, just slightly. "No," he said, shaking his head once as if correcting a minor error. "You're nobody." Silence followed. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just heavy. The kind that settles into the corners of a room and waits. Naomi didn't argue. Didn't flinch. She just looked at him for one quiet second longer, then lowered her eyes back to the table. And in the reflection beneath his hand, something in the room had already begun to change. No one spoke. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, like ice under pressure. A man near the center of the table leaned back slightly, adjusting his glasses, eyes flicking down to the document in front of him. Another tapped the edge of his tablet, scrolling, searching. The faint hum of the air conditioning suddenly felt. Louder, like the room itself was listening. Richard Hale did not move his pen. It hovered just above the paper, steady, controlled, but no longer certain. His gaze remained on Naomi, sharp now, not amused anymore. Measuring. "You are out of line," he said, voice low, precise. Not raised, not emotional. Worse, dismissive. Naomi nodded once, as if accepting the statement, but she did not step back. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "But the clause still stands." A faint shift passed through the room. Not agreement. Not yet. Just discomfort. One of the executives cleared his throat again, this time unable to stop himself. "Richard," he said carefully, turning the page in front of him. "Maybe we should just take a second look." Another voice joined, softer but firmer. Page 14, second paragraph. The words echoed what Naomi had already said, but now they sounded different. Valid. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He did not like repetition, especially not when it came from below him. Slowly, he lowered the pen onto the table. The soft click as it touched the glass sounded louder than it should have. He flipped the pages himself now, fingers moving faster than before, controlled but urgent beneath the surface. The room leaned in without moving. Eyes followed his hands, his expression, the slight narrowing of his gaze as he scanned the text. Seconds passed, then more. Naomi stepped back half a step, not retreating, just giving the table space again. Her hands rested at her sides now, still, steady, the faint scent of cleaner still clinging to her skin. She did not watch him. Instead, she looked at the reflection again, the overhead lights cutting across the glass like lines drawn too straight to ignore. "It is structured to look standard," she added, not louder, not softer, just clear. "But the liability shifts after execution. Not before." No one laughed this time. A man near the end of the table leaned forward, elbows resting on the polished surface, eyes scanning rapidly now. "She is right," he murmured, almost to himself. Another executive nodded slowly, lips pressing together. "This is not balanced." The energy in the room changed, subtle but undeniable. Confidence drained out in quiet increments, replaced by something sharper. Awareness. Richard stopped flipping pages. His finger rested on a single line. He read it again. Then again. The muscles in his jaw flexed once. Then stilled. When he finally looked up, it was not at Naomi first. It was at the others. The people who had just seconds ago been ready to sign without hesitation. Now they avoided his eyes. Not out of fear. Out of realization. Then, slowly, his gaze returned to her. Naomi did not move. Did not speak. She simply stood there, as she had been the entire time, present in a space that had never intended to include her. "Who told you this?" he asked. The question was not an accusation. It was something else. Searching. Naomi shook her head slightly. "No one," she said. A beat passed. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "I read it." The room fell into a different kind of silence now. Not the one that comes from dismissal, but the one that follows when something has shifted and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough for the leather chair to respond beneath him. His hand hovered near the pen again, but he did not pick it up. Not this time. Not yet. And for the first time since the meeting began, the deal was no longer the most important thing in the room. The meeting did not end with a decision. It ended with hesitation. Chairs shifted back slowly, not with the usual confidence of people closing a deal, but with the careful distance of those who had almost made a mistake. Papers were gathered, but not stacked neatly. Voices returned, but lower now, threaded with something unspoken. Naomi moved first. Not toward the door, not immediately. She stepped back to the edge of the room, picked up her cloth from the corner of the table, and folded it again with the same quiet precision. No one told her to stop. No one told her to leave. For a moment, she simply stood there, invisible again, but not in the same way as before. Richard remained seated longer than anyone else. His hand rested flat on the page he had been reading, fingers spread slightly, as if holding it in place. He had read that clause 3 times. Then 4. Each time, it looked more obvious. Not because it had changed, but because he had not seen it before. Across the table, one of the senior partners closed his briefcase with a soft click. "We should have legal review this again," he said carefully. Not blaming. Not accusing. Just stating what was now unavoidable. Another nodded. "We almost signed that." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Almost. Richard did not respond right away. His eyes shifted, not to the speakers, but to the space where Naomi had been standing moments ago. She was still there, just beyond the table now, hands still, posture calm, as if none of this had touched her. That was what unsettled him. Not what she said, not even that she was right. It was how easily she had stood in the middle of a room that was not built for her, and spoken without asking for permission. "You can all go," Richard said finally, his voice even, but quieter than before. There was no resistance. No follow-up questions. Chairs pushed back. Shoes moved across marble. One by one, the room emptied, leaving behind the faint echo of movement and the low hum of the building beyond the glass walls. Within minutes, the long table was clear, except for a single stack of documents and a silver pin resting beside it. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to leave now that the room had returned to its usual order. She took a step toward the door. "Wait." The word stopped her, not sharply, but firmly enough to settle in place. She paused, then turned back. Richard was standing now, not at the head of the table anymore, but beside it, closer than before, though still separated by the length of polished glass. He studied her again, but differently this time. Not dismissing, not amused. Something else. "You said you read it," he said. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Where?" The question was simple, but it carried weight now. Not authority. Curiosity. Naomi glanced briefly at the stack of documents, then back at him. "It was left by the copier earlier," she said. "I saw the header. It looked important." Richard's gaze flicked to the papers, then back to her. "And you just decided to step in?" Naomi held his eyes for a moment. Not defiant, just honest. "I decided not to ignore it." The answer settled between them, quiet and complete. Richard exhaled slowly, one hand moving to rest against the edge of the table. He looked down at the contract again, then back at her, as if trying to reconcile two different realities in the same space. The cleaner, and the one person who had seen what no one else had. "What is your position here?" he asked. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the folded cloth, then relaxed. "Temporary cleaning staff," she said. A small pause. Then, almost as if clarifying something that mattered more than the title, she added, "Night shift." Richard nodded once, but his expression did not settle. It shifted, not into respect, not yet, but into something closer to awareness. And in the quiet that followed, the distance between them no longer felt as certain as it had an hour ago. The room felt larger after that, not because anything had changed in its size, but because something invisible had shifted out of place. Naomi did not move right away. She stood where she was, the folded cloth still in her hand, the faint scent of cleaner lingering between them like a quiet reminder of where she was supposed to belong. Richard walked slowly along the edge of the table, his steps measured, each one softer than the last, as if the room no longer belonged entirely to him. He stopped across from her, not close enough to invade her space, but no longer distant enough to ignore her presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city stretched behind the glass walls, muted by height and distance, cars moving like silent lines of light far below, people reduced to motion without sound. "You read contracts in your spare time?" he asked finally, the question carrying less weight than before, but more meaning. Naomi's lips pressed together briefly, not in hesitation, but in thought. "I read what I can," she said. Her voice remained steady, the same quiet tone that had cut through the room earlier without effort. Richard tilted his head slightly, studying her again, but this time the details seemed to register differently. Not just the uniform, not just the badge, but the way she stood, the way she chose her words without rushing. "That clause was not obvious," he said. "It was meant to pass unnoticed." Naomi nodded once. "Most things that matter are." The answer landed without force, but it stayed. Richard glanced down at the contract again, fingers brushing the edge of the paper as if confirming it was still there, still real. "If you had not spoken," he said, almost to himself, "we would have signed it." Naomi did not respond immediately. She looked at the table, at the reflection of the lights, at the place where his pen had hovered minutes earlier. "Yes," she said quietly. The word did not accuse. It simply existed. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just present. Richard straightened slightly, one hand moving to his pocket, then stopping halfway as if he had forgotten what he intended to do. Why did you care? He asked. The question was direct now, stripped of tone, stripped of expectation. Naomi looked at him, really looked this time, not at his suit or his position, but at the person standing in front of her. Because it was wrong, she said. No elaboration. No explanation. Just the truth as she saw it. Richard exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him longer than it should have, as if something inside him had loosened without permission. He nodded once, though it was not clear whether he agreed or simply accepted the answer. You understand, he said after a moment, that speaking like that in this room could cost you your job. Naomi's fingers shifted slightly against the cloth, then stilled again. Yes, sir. And you still did it. She did not look away. Yes, sir. The repetition settled into the space between them, simple and undeniable. Richard looked at her for a long second, then another, as if waiting for something more, some justification, some sign of uncertainty. There was none, just quiet certainty. He turned away briefly, walking a few steps toward the window, his reflection joining the city behind the glass. For the first time that day, he did not look like someone in control of everything around him. He looked like someone thinking. When he turned back, his expression had changed again. Not softened, not hardened, just different. What is your last name? He asked. Naomi hesitated for the briefest moment, then answered. Carter. Richard repeated it under his breath, as if committing it to memory. Carter. He nodded once, then looked back at the contract, then at her. Go ahead and finish your shift, he said, the words returning to their usual structure, but not their usual tone. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Yes, sir. She turned toward the door, her steps quiet against the marble, the same as before. But this time, as she reached the threshold, the room did not feel like it was closing behind her. It felt like it was holding something open. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it should have. Not from temperature, but from contrast. Naomi stepped out, the soft click of the door sealing behind her, and for a moment she stood still, letting the quiet settle back into her bones. The noise of the meeting did not follow her. It stayed inside, contained, like something that had not yet decided what it was. Down the corridor, the building returned to its usual rhythm. Phones ringing in the distance. The low murmur of conversations behind closed office doors. The steady hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Familiar. Predictable. Safe. She adjusted her grip on the cloth in her hand and began walking, her steps measured, unhurried, blending back into the flow of a place that rarely noticed who kept it running. A few employees passed her without looking. One nodded absent-mindedly, already focused on whatever waited on their screen. Another stepped slightly to the side, not out of politeness, but habit. Make space. Keep moving. Do not engage. Naomi did not mind. She had learned long ago that invisibility could be a kind of quiet protection. But today, it felt different. Not gone. Just thinner. She reached the service closet at the end of the hall and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was warmer, heavier, carrying the scent of supplies stacked neatly on metal shelves. Buckets, bottles, folded linens, each one placed with intention. She set the cloth down on the edge of a cart and rinsed her hands under the small sink, the water running clear, then slightly cloudy, then clear again. She watched it for a second longer than necessary, the sound steady, grounding. In the reflection of the small mirror above the sink, she saw herself as the building saw her. Uniform. Name tag slightly tilted. Nothing remarkable. She dried her hands, folded the towel carefully, and placed it back where it belonged. Then she stood there, just for a moment, not moving, not thinking too far ahead. The door opened behind her with a soft creak. You good? The voice was familiar. Marcus, another night shift worker, leaned against the frame, arms crossed loosely, his expression curious but not intrusive. Naomi turned slightly, offering a small nod. I am fine, she said. Marcus studied her for a second, then glanced down the hallway, then back at her. Word travels fast, he said quietly. People are talking. Naomi did not ask what they were saying. She already knew the shape of it. Surprise. Disbelief. Maybe a little amusement. Maybe a little irritation. They usually do, she replied. Marcus let out a short breath, something close to a laugh, but not quite. You stepped into that room like you belonged there. Naomi's gaze drifted briefly toward the open doorway, toward the hallway beyond. I stepped in because I was already there, she said. Marcus shook his head slightly, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Still, he said, not many people would have said anything. Naomi picked up the cloth again, folding it once more, aligning the edges carefully. Most people do not want to risk being seen, she said. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding more than he said out loud. And you? He asked. Naomi paused, her hands still for just a second. Then she looked up, her expression calm, unchanged. I did not want to pretend I did not see. The answer settled into the small room. Simple, clear, without weight, but impossible to ignore. Marcus pushed himself off the doorframe, stepping aside. Well, he said, whatever happens next, you did something. Naomi did not respond to that. She simply moved past him, guiding the cart back into the hallway, the wheels rolling softly against the floor. As she continued down the corridor, the building did not look different. The walls were the same. The lights were the same. The people were the same. But somewhere, just beneath the surface, something had shifted. Not loudly. Not visibly. Just enough to be felt if you were paying attention. And Naomi Carter was. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Naomi guided the cart inside, the wheels clicking faintly over the metal threshold before settling into stillness. She pressed the button for the lower floors, her fingers steady, then stepped back as the doors closed, sealing her into a smaller, quieter space. The hum of the elevator wrapped around her, a low vibration that filled the silence without asking anything in return. For a moment, she let her shoulders drop, just slightly, the tension of the last hour loosening in places she had not realized were tight. The mirror along the back wall reflected her again, but this time the image felt different. Not changed, just seen. The numbers above the door lit up one by one as the elevator descended. 26, 25, 24. Each floor passed without interruption, but her mind did not stay still. It moved, not fast, not chaotic, but deliberate, replaying small details. The pause of the pen, the shift in the room, the way the laughter had stopped. Not because she had demanded it, but because something else had replaced it. Understanding, maybe, or doubt. The elevator slowed, then stopped. The doors opened onto a quieter level, one most employees rarely noticed. Storage rooms, maintenance offices, spaces that existed to support everything above without being acknowledged. Naomi pushed the cart forward, the wheels rolling softer here, the air warmer, less filtered. A flicker of fluorescent light buzzed overhead, then steadied. She moved down the corridor, passing closed doors with labels that no one read unless they needed something from behind them. The routine returned to her body easily. Wipe, rinse, fold, replace. Each motion precise, practiced, requiring just enough attention to keep her grounded. But even as her hands moved, something else stayed with her. The look on Richard's face when he had read the clause again. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to interruption. Like a pattern he trusted had been broken without warning. She stopped at a window halfway down the hall, one of the few that looked out onto the city from this level. The glass was not as clear as the ones upstairs, a faint haze softening the view, but the lights beyond were still visible, stretching out in long lines, steady and distant. She lifted the cloth and wiped a small circle in the center, clearing just enough space to see through more sharply. Cars moved below, their headlights tracing paths that never crossed, each one following a route decided long before they started. Naomi watched for a second, then another, her breath steady, her expression unchanged. Behind her, a door opened. Footsteps approached, slower than most, deliberate in a way that did not belong to this floor. She did not turn right away. She finished the motion she had started, folding the cloth once more, then letting her hand rest against the edge of the window. You are still here. The voice carried differently in this hallway. Less commanding, more contained. Naomi turned then, not startled, not hurried. Richard stood a few feet away, his jacket unbuttoned now, his posture less rigid than before, though not relaxed. He looked out of place here, not because he did not belong in the building, but because this part of it had never been designed for him. Naomi inclined her head slightly. Yes, sir, she said. I am finishing my shift. Richard glanced around briefly, taking in the corridor, the carts, the quiet details that rarely reached his attention. Then his eyes returned to her. I had my legal team review the contract again, he said. Naomi waited, not asking, not reacting, just listening. You were right. he added after a moment. The words did not come easily, but they came clearly. Naomi nodded once. Yes, sir. There was no pride in it. No satisfaction. Just acknowledgement. Richard studied her for a second longer, as if expecting more, some shift in her tone, some sign that the balance between them had changed. It had, just not in the way he understood yet. Most people would have said nothing, he said. Naomi met his gaze, steady as before. Most people are not asked to clean the table they are about to be hurt by, she replied. The sentence settled into the space between them, quiet but undeniable. Richard did not respond immediately. He looked at her, really looked this time, not past her, not through her, but at her. And in that moment, the distance between the top floor and the one they stood on no longer felt like just a matter of floors. Richard did not look away after she spoke. The words stayed between them, not sharp, not aggressive, but anchored in something he could not dismiss. For a moment, the hallway felt narrower, as if the space itself had shifted to hold the weight of what had just been said. He glanced toward the window, toward the city lights stretching outward, then back at her, as if measuring distance in a way he had never needed to before. That is not how I intended it, he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the confidence that had filled the boardroom earlier. Naomi did not respond right away. She turned slightly, guiding the cloth across the glass again, smoothing out a faint streak she had missed. The motion was small, almost automatic, but it gave her a second to let his words settle without reacting to them. Intent does not always change impact, she said, her tone even, neither correcting nor accusing, just stating something that had been true long before this moment. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. He nodded once, a short movement, as if accepting something he had not expected to face today. The hum of the overhead light flickered again, then steadied, casting a consistent glow across the corridor. It highlighted the difference between them without needing to say it. The tailored suit, the cleaning cart, the distance that had defined everything until now. You said you read what you can, he continued, shifting the conversation, but not escaping it. Where did you learn to read contracts like that? Naomi folded the cloth once more, aligning the edges carefully before placing it on the cart. From my father, she said. The answer came simply, without hesitation. Richard waited, sensing there was more, but not pushing for it. Naomi's eyes moved briefly toward the window again, as if the memory was somewhere out there, just beyond the glass. He worked in compliance, she added. He used to bring work home. He said if you understand the details, no one can hide anything from you. Richard absorbed that quietly, his gaze shifting slightly as the context reshaped what he had seen earlier. Not an interruption, not a mistake, a skill. And now you clean floors, he said, not as a judgment, but as a question he did not know how to ask directly. Naomi met his eyes again, her expression unchanged. Right now, yes. There was no bitterness in it. No apology. Just truth. Richard exhaled slowly, one hand moving to rest against the side of the cart, his fingers brushing the metal frame as if grounding himself in something more tangible than the conversation. You could have stayed silent, he said again, though the statement carried less weight now, more reflection than warning. Naomi nodded slightly. I could have, she said. A pause. Then, softer, but just as steady. But then it would not have been just your loss. The words shifted something again, not in the room, but in him. Richard straightened slightly, stepping back half a pace, creating space where there had been tension. He looked at her, not as someone passing through his building, but as someone who had altered its course without permission. What are you planning to do after this? He asked. Naomi glanced down at the cart, then back up. Finish my shift, she said. The answer was simple, but it carried something else beneath it. Continuity. Discipline. A refusal to let one moment redefine everything. Richard let out a small breath, something close to a quiet acknowledgement. He nodded once more, slower this time. Of course, he said. For a second, neither of them moved. The hallway returned to its steady rhythm, the building continuing around them as if nothing had changed. But something had. Not loudly, not visibly, just enough to make the silence feel different. Richard turned slightly, as if to leave, then paused, his hand hovering near his pocket before dropping again. He looked back at her one last time, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. Naomi Carter, he said, repeating her name with more certainty than before. She inclined her head slightly in response. Then he walked away, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving behind a space that felt less defined by distance and more by what had been seen within it. Naomi watched him go for a moment, then turned back to the window, lifting the cloth once more, her movement steady, unchanged, even as the world around her began, quietly, to shift. The hallway settled back into its usual rhythm after Richard left, but the quiet did not feel the same. Naomi stood by the window for a few seconds longer, the cloth moving in slow, controlled circles across the glass, though it no longer needed cleaning. The city beyond remained steady, headlights tracing their paths, distant and unaffected. She lowered the cloth, folded it once, then placed it back on the cart with care. Routine returned, but something beneath it stayed awake. She moved down the corridor, guiding the cart toward the next section of offices, the wheels rolling softly over the polished floor. Doors lined the hallway, each one closed, each one holding conversations, decisions, and lives that rarely crossed into hers. She stopped at the first door, pushing it open gently with her shoulder. Inside, the office was dim, the overhead lights off, only a desk lamp, casting a warm circle over scattered papers and a half-empty coffee cup. The air carried a faint scent of stale espresso and printer ink. Naomi stepped in, her movements quiet, practiced, almost invisible. She began with the desk, aligning the papers without reading them, wiping the surface in smooth, even strokes. The small details anchored her. The edges of the desk, the curve of the chair, the reflection of light on polished wood. But even as she worked, her mind returned to the conversation in the hallway. Not the words themselves, but the pauses between them. The moments where something unspoken had surfaced and stayed. She finished the desk, moved to the window, and pulled the blind halfway up to clean the glass behind it. The city looked different from this angle, framed, contained, less expansive. She wiped slowly, the cloth catching a faint streak of dust, clearing it in one pass. A soft knock echoed from the open doorway behind her. She turned slightly. A woman stood there, one of the executives from earlier, her posture composed but her expression uncertain, as if she had stepped into a space she did not usually enter. "Naomi, right?" the woman asked, her voice careful, not out of politeness, but out of adjustment. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." The woman stepped inside, heels clicking softly against the floor, then stopping as she took in the room, the cart, the quiet order of it. "I was in the meeting," she said, though she did not need to explain. "I just wanted to say something." Naomi waited, her hands resting lightly against the edge of the desk. The woman hesitated for a moment, then continued. "What you did, it mattered." The words were simple, but they carried weight in the way they were delivered, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "I did what I thought was right," she said. The woman nodded, her gaze shifting briefly to the window, then back. "Most people in that room would not have caught that," she said, "and even fewer would have said anything." Naomi did not respond to that. She had already said enough earlier. The woman exhaled softly, as if releasing something she had been holding since the meeting ended. "We are reviewing everything now," she added. "The entire deal. Because of you." Naomi absorbed that quietly, her expression unchanged. "That is good," she said. The woman studied her for a second, perhaps expecting more, some sign of pride or relief, but there was none. Just calm, just presence. "If you ever," the woman began, then stopped, reconsidering her words. "If you ever want something more than this," she said finally, gesturing lightly toward the cart, "you should let someone know." Naomi's gaze followed the gesture briefly, then returned to the woman. "I already know," she said. The answer was soft, but it settled with clarity. The woman held her eyes for a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding more than she had expected to. "Right," she said. "Of course you do." She stepped back toward the door, pausing once more before leaving. "Thank you," she added, not as a formality, but as something meant. Naomi inclined her head again. "You are welcome." The woman left, her footsteps fading into the hallway, leaving the office quiet once more. Naomi turned back to the window, lifting the cloth again, her movements steady, unchanged. But this time, as she wiped the glass, the reflection looking back at her did not feel quite as invisible as it had before. The office returned to stillness after the woman left, but it was not the same kind of stillness as before. It carried something now, something that lingered in the air like a thought that refused to settle. Naomi finished the window slowly, her movements precise, the cloth gliding across the glass until no trace of dust remained. She stepped back, just enough to see the full reflection, the room behind her layered over the city beyond. For a second, she let herself stand there without moving, without reaching for the next task. Then she turned, guiding the cart toward the door. The hallway felt quieter than before, as if the building itself was holding something in place, waiting. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps. The late hour had begun to thin the energy out of the upper floors. Naomi moved to the next office, repeating the same pattern. Door open, lights off, desk first, then the surfaces, then the glass. Each step grounded, familiar, a rhythm she had followed so many nights that her body no longer needed to think about it. But tonight, the rhythm felt like it was carrying something forward, not just maintaining what already existed. Halfway through the room, her phone vibrated softly in the pocket of her uniform. She paused, not immediately reaching for it. It was not a habit she allowed herself often during work. But the vibration came again, short, insistent, then stopped. She set the cloth down carefully on the edge of the desk, wiped her hands once against her uniform, and pulled the phone out. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow against her fingers. An unknown number. No name. Just a message. She stared at it for a second before opening it. The text was simple, direct. Be in the main conference room at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Do not be late. No signature. No explanation. Just the instruction. Naomi read it once. Then again. The time registered first. Morning shift. Not hers. Then the location. The same room. The same table. The same place where everything had shifted. She lowered the phone slightly, her thumb resting against the edge of the screen. For a moment, she did not move. The building hummed around her, steady, unchanged, as if nothing about tomorrow had been decided yet. She placed the phone back into her pocket, not rushing, not reacting outwardly. But something inside her adjusted. Not fear, not anticipation, just awareness. She picked up the cloth again and resumed her work, finishing the desk, aligning the chair, restoring the room to the version it was meant to present in the morning. But now, the morning carried weight. When she stepped back into the hallway, the lights seemed brighter than before, the reflections sharper against the polished floor. She guided the cart forward, continuing down the corridor, but her pace had shifted just slightly. Not faster, not slower, just more deliberate. At the far end of the hallway, the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. A few employees stepped out, their conversations quiet, their movements tired. One of them glanced in her direction, then did a double take, recognition flickering for just a second before being replaced by something else. Respect, maybe, or uncertainty. Naomi did not stop. She continued forward, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. The cart moved with her, wheels rolling in a straight line, the sound consistent, grounding. She reached the final office on the floor and pushed the door open, stepping inside as she had done countless times before. But this time, as she set the cart in place and reached for the cloth, her reflection in the darkened window looked different. Not because anything about her had changed, but because something about how the room would see her tomorrow already had. And somewhere above, in a room filled with glass and silence, a decision was already taking shape. Morning arrived without ceremony. The building did not announce it, but it showed in the light. Warmer, sharper. The glass walls that had reflected only darkness hours ago now held the city in full motion, every line and shadow clear. Naomi stood at the entrance of the building for a brief second before stepping inside, her uniform replaced by something simpler, cleaner, chosen with intention but without display. The lobby carried a different energy at this hour. Conversations layered over one another, footsteps quicker, voices carrying purpose. People moved with direction, eyes forward, phones in hand, unaware of how easily routine could be interrupted. Naomi walked through it without hesitation, her pace steady, her posture unchanged. No cart this time. No supplies. Just presence. The elevator doors opened as she approached, and she stepped inside along with a small group of employees, their conversations quiet but constant. No one spoke to her. A few glanced, then looked away, unsure where to place her in the morning version of the building. The numbers climbed. 10, 15, 20. The higher they went, the quieter it became. Conversations faded. Phones lowered. By the time the doors opened onto the executive floor, the air had shifted again. Cooler, more controlled, the silence intentional. Naomi stepped out first. The hallway was already active, but not loud. Assistants moved quickly between offices, carrying folders, tablets, quiet urgency. A few heads turned as she walked past. Recognition flickered again, but this time it held longer. Not curiosity, something else. She continued forward, her steps measured against the polished floor, each one echoing just enough to be heard. At the end of the corridor, the glass doors of the main conference room stood closed. Inside, silhouettes moved, figures already seated, the outline of the long table visible through the frosted panels. Naomi paused just outside, her hand resting lightly against the handle, not pushing it open yet. The reflection in the glass showed her clearly now. Not distorted, not dim, just present. She took a breath. Not deep, not dramatic, just enough. Then she opened the door. The room fell quiet in a way that did not need to be announced. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs shifted slightly. Eyes turned, one by one, toward the entrance. Naomi stepped inside, her gaze steady, her expression calm. The table was already filled. Executives, partners, advisors. The same faces from the day before, but arranged differently now. More alert, more aware. At the head of the table, Richard Hale sat with a folder in front of him, his posture composed, but his eyes already on her. He did not speak. Not yet. Naomi moved forward, each step measured, the distance between the door and the table shortening with quiet certainty. No one interrupted her. No one questioned her presence. But the room did not understand it either. Not fully. She stopped at the side of the table, not sitting, not taking a seat that had not been offered. Just standing. Present. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but charged. Then, one of the senior partners cleared his throat, breaking the surface tension just enough to allow sound back in. "We are waiting on one more person," he said, glancing at his watch. Richard's gaze did not leave Naomi. "No," he said quietly. The words settled into the room with weight. "We are not." The partner looked up, confused for a brief second, then followed Richard's line of sight. Back to her. A subtle shift moved through the room, like a ripple no one could quite trace. Naomi did not move, did not speak. She simply stood there, the same way she had stood the day before, but the space around her no longer treated her the same. Richard reached for the folder in front of him, his fingers resting against its edge before opening it slowly. The sound of paper moving echoed more than it should have. He looked down briefly, then back up at the room, then finally back at Naomi. And in that moment, the balance that had once been unquestioned no longer felt fixed. It felt about to change. No one reached for their pen this time. No one shuffled papers to fill the silence. The room held still, as if every person inside it understood, without being told, that something had already begun. Richard Hale remained seated at the head of the table, the folder now open in front of him, but his attention was no longer on the documents. It was on Naomi. He let the silence stretch just long enough to settle over everyone in the room, long enough for them to feel it, not just hear it. Then he closed the folder. Not abruptly, deliberately. The soft sound of it echoed against the glass walls, marking a shift that did not need explanation. "Before we proceed," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but different from the day before. "There is something that needs to be addressed." A few executives straightened slightly. One reached for a pen, then stopped. The air tightened, not with tension, but with expectation. Richard stood, moving away from his chair, not to the head of the table, but to the side, creating a space that had not existed before. His hand gestured lightly, not commanding, not dismissing, just indicating. Toward Naomi. "Ms. Carter," he said, using her name with clarity now, "would you join us?" The words landed carefully, but their meaning was immediate. A subtle ripple moved through the room. Chairs shifted. Eyes widened just slightly, then quickly masked. Naomi did not react outwardly. She stepped forward, her movements steady, unhurried, crossing the final distance to the table without hesitation. The same distance she had stood outside of the day before. Now, she stood within it. No one stopped her. No one questioned it. But the room watched closely, every detail registering. Richard moved his chair back slightly, not fully stepping away, but no longer occupying the space as he had before. "Please," he said, indicating the seat beside him. "Not below, not behind. Beside." Naomi paused for a brief second, her hand resting lightly against the back of the chair. Then she sat. The movement was simple, but it shifted the entire room. The perspective changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Richard remained standing for a moment longer, allowing the adjustment to settle. Then he looked around the table, meeting each set of eyes, not avoiding the question he knew was forming. "Yesterday," he continued, "we were prepared to sign an agreement that would have exposed this company to significant risk." No one interrupted. No one needed to. They all knew. "That did not happen," he said. A pause. Because Ms. Carter chose to speak. The acknowledgement was direct, unembellished, but it carried weight in the way it was delivered. A few executives exchanged brief glances. Not disagreement. Recognition. Richard's gaze shifted back to Naomi for a moment, then returned to the room. "This morning, the board reviewed the situation," he said, "and a decision was made." The words hung there, incomplete, but heavy. Naomi's posture remained unchanged. Hands resting lightly on the table, eyes forward, expression calm. The same as before. But now, the room was aligned differently around her. Richard stepped slightly to the side, no longer at the head, no longer the single point of focus. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice steady, each word placed with precision. "Ms. Naomi Carter will be serving as interim chair for this division's compliance oversight." The silence that followed was not confusion. It was impact. Immediate. Absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. The title settled into the room, into the table, into the space each person occupied. Naomi did not react outwardly. Not with surprise. Not with hesitation. She simply sat there, present, as if the role had not changed who she was, only where she was now placed. Richard looked at her then, not as someone above or below, but as someone he had not seen clearly before. "She saw what we did not," he added quietly. The statement did not need emphasis. It stood on its own. Around the table, the shift completed itself. Not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And for the first time, the room did not just see Naomi Carter. It adjusted to her. The silence did not break right away. It settled deeper, pressing gently against the edges of the room until it became something everyone had to sit with. Naomi remained still in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the table, her posture unchanged despite the shift that had just taken place. Around her, the executives adjusted slowly, not physically at first, but mentally, recalibrating the structure they had relied on. Titles, roles, expectations. None of them aligned the same way anymore. One of the senior partners cleared his throat, a subtle signal that the room needed to move forward, even if it had not fully caught up. "Then perhaps," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, "we should proceed with a revised review of the agreement." His gaze flickered briefly toward Naomi, not dismissive, not fully confident either, but acknowledging the new reality without yet knowing how to navigate it. Naomi inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than a longer response would have. "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, even, but it landed differently now. Not because it was louder, but because it was placed differently within the room. The same words, but heard from a different position. Richard remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly took his seat, not at the head in the same way as before, but slightly angled, his presence no longer dominating the table. His eyes moved briefly toward Naomi, then to the documents, then to the others, as if adjusting his own role in real time. Naomi reached for the folder in front of her, opening it with controlled precision. The sound of the pages turning was soft, but it carried through the room, drawing attention without asking for it. She scanned the first page, her eyes moving steadily, not rushed, not hesitant. The room watched. Not openly, but enough. "We will start with the liability structure," she said, her tone clear, structured, guiding rather than interrupting. She turned the page slightly, aligning it with the edge of the table. "The clause on page 14 is not isolated," she continued. "It connects to the indemnification language on page 19. A few heads lowered immediately, following her lead, flipping pages, checking references. The shift was subtle but complete. The room was no longer waiting for permission to listen. It was already doing it. Naomi paused briefly, not for effect, but to allow the information to settle. If both sections remain as written, she added, the exposure compounds. Not just legally. Financially. One of the legal advisors leaned forward, scanning quickly, his expression tightening slightly as the connection became clear. She is right, he said quietly, almost echoing the moment from the day before, but without hesitation this time. Another executive nodded, tapping a note into his tablet. We will need to restructure both sections, he said. Naomi acknowledged the comment with a slight nod, then continued, her focus returning to the document. No pause for validation. No shift in tone. Just continuity. Richard watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, but his attention fixed. Not on the fact that she was speaking, but on how she was speaking. Measured. Clear. Without needing to prove anything beyond the work itself. The room moved with her now. Not because they were told to. Because it made sense to. Papers turned in sync. Notes were taken. Questions were framed more carefully. The energy had changed from control to alignment. Naomi closed the folder briefly, resting her hand against it. We will revise this section before moving forward, she said. The statement was not a suggestion. It was a direction, and no one questioned it. Around the table, the adjustment completed itself, not loudly, not visibly, but fully. Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not claim authority. She did not remind anyone of what had happened the day before. She did not need to. The room already remembered. And now, it responded. The meeting did not rush to an end. It unfolded with a different kind of pace now, one that followed thought instead of momentum. Papers were no longer turned out of habit, but with intention. Each page carried weight. Each clause examined with a level of attention that had been missing before. Naomi remained steady at the table, her focus anchored in the work, her presence no longer questioned but not yet fully understood either. That was fine. Understanding was not required for clarity to exist. A legal advisor leaned forward again, marking a section with his pen. If we adjust the indemnification language here, he said, glancing briefly at Naomi, we can reduce exposure without restructuring the entire agreement. Naomi looked at the section he indicated, her eyes moving across the lines quickly, connecting what was written to what was implied. That would address the surface risk, she said, her voice even, but not the underlying shift in responsibility. She turned the page slightly, aligning two sections side by side. The issue is not just how the clause reads, she continued. It is how it interacts with everything around it. The advisor paused, then nodded slowly, recognizing the distinction. Understood, he said. Around the table, the others adjusted again, not resisting, but refining. The conversation deepened, moving beyond correction into awareness. Richard sat quietly through most of it, his hands resting loosely in front of him, his attention fixed not on controlling the discussion, but on observing it. Observing her. He noticed the way she did not rush to fill silence, how she allowed space for others to process, how she did not speak to dominate, but to clarify. It was a different kind of authority, not declared, not enforced, simply present. At one point, one of the executives hesitated. Before speaking, his usual confidence replaced by a more measured tone. Ms. Carter, he said, the title coming naturally now. Do you recommend we pause the agreement entirely? Naomi considered the question, not immediately answering. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the folder, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. No, she said after a moment. I recommend we understand it fully before we decide what to do with it. The answer settled into the room, not dramatic, not absolute, but precise. The difference mattered. The executive nodded, taking note without pushing further. The meeting continued, not as a sequence of decisions, but as a process of uncovering, layer by layer, detail by detail. And with each step, the room aligned more closely with her pace, her clarity, her way of seeing what others had overlooked. Eventually, the discussion slowed, not because it was forced to stop, but because it had reached a point of completion for the moment. Naomi closed the folder in front of her, the sound soft but final. She rested her hand on top of it for a second, then lifted it away. Around the table, others did the same, their movements echoing hers without realizing it. The room did not erupt into conversation. It did not break into side discussions. It simply settled. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze moving across the table, taking in the shift that had taken place, not just in the work, but in the people. Then his eyes returned to Naomi. "We will reconvene after revisions are drafted," he said, his voice steady, but no longer the center of the room. Just part of it. Heads nodded. Chairs moved. Papers were gathered. But the movement felt different now. Less hurried. More deliberate. Naomi remained seated for a moment longer as the room began to clear, her posture unchanged, her presence still anchored at the table. One by one, the others left, their steps quieter than before, their glances toward her no longer uncertain, but acknowledging something that had been established without being announced. When the room was nearly empty, Richard stood, adjusting his jacket slightly, then pausing as if considering whether to speak. For a brief second, he did not. Then he looked at her, not as a question, not as a command, but as recognition. "You did not change the deal," he said quietly. Naomi looked up at him, her expression calm, steady. "No," she replied. Richard nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "You changed how we see it." Naomi did not answer that. She did not need to. The room already held the truth of it. And as the last of the footsteps faded into the hallway, the silence that remained no longer felt empty. It felt earned. The room emptied slowly, but the quiet it left behind did not feel temporary. It lingered, stretching across the glass walls, settling into the long table, holding on to the shape of what had just happened. Naomi remained seated for a moment after the last executive stepped out, her hand resting lightly on the closed folder in front of her. The city beyond the windows moved as it always did, steady and indifferent, but inside the room, something had been altered in a way that would not reset with the next meeting. She stood, not abruptly, but with the same controlled motion she had carried from the very beginning, and adjusted the chair back into place without thinking. The gesture was small, almost instinctive, a habit from a role she had not rejected, only stepped beyond. Behind her, the door opened again. The sound was soft, but distinct enough to draw her attention without urgency. Richard stepped back into the room, alone this time, the absence of others making his presence feel different. Less guarded, less defined by expectation. He closed the door behind him, the quiet click marking a boundary between this moment and everything outside it. For a second, neither of them spoke. The distance between them was shorter now, but it carried more meaning than it had before. Richard walked toward the table, his steps measured, stopping across from where she stood. He did not reach for the chair. He did not take his place at the head. He remained standing, as if the position no longer fit the same way. "You handled that well," he said, his voice steady, but without the sharp edge it had once carried. Naomi inclined her head slightly. "It needed to be done," she replied. Richard nodded once, his gaze shifting briefly to the folder, then back to her. "You could have used this differently," he said. The words were not an accusation. They were an observation. Naomi understood what he meant without needing him to explain. She could have made the moment about the past, about the word he had used, about the line he had drawn without thinking. Instead, she had not. She looked at him, her expression unchanged, her posture calm. "That would not have fixed the problem," she said. The answer settled into the space between them, quiet but complete. Richard exhaled slowly, one hand moving to rest against the edge of the table, his fingers tracing the surface lightly, as if grounding himself in something real. "I said something yesterday," he continued, his voice lower now, more deliberate. Naomi did not interrupt. She did not need to. "I should not have," he added. The words were simple, direct, not dressed in explanation or justification. Just there. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, not measuring, not judging, just acknowledging the space he had stepped into by saying it. "No," she said. A pause. Then, softer, but just as steady, "You should not have." There was no anger in it. No emphasis. Just truth. Richard nodded once, accepting it without resistance. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It did not carry tension. It carried resolution. Not complete, but real. Naomi reached for the folder, lifting it slightly, then setting it back down in its place. The movement was small, but it marked something. Continuation. Forward. "We still have work to do," she said. Richard looked at her, then at the table, then back again. For the first time, the statement did not feel like something beneath him. It felt like something shared. Yes, he said. We do. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to leave, her steps aligning with the rhythm she had carried through every part of the building. At the door, she paused for a brief second, her hand resting lightly against the handle. Without turning back, she spoke, her voice calm, steady, but carrying something that would remain long after the room was empty. No one is nobody, she said. The words did not echo. They settled. Richard did not respond right away. He stood there, the room around him quiet, the city beyond still moving, and for the first time, the silence did not feel like something he controlled. It felt like something he was learning to understand. The door closed softly behind Naomi, the sound barely more than a shift in air, but it marked the end of something that had begun long before either of them realized it. The hallway outside carried on as usual, footsteps moving, voices low, the steady rhythm of a building that did not pause for individual moments. Naomi walked forward without looking back, her pace even, her posture unchanged, but the space around her no longer treated her the same. People noticed now. Not all of them. Not all at once. But enough. A glance that lingered a second longer. A conversation that quieted as she passed. Not out of discomfort. Out of awareness. She reached the elevator and pressed the button, her reflection appearing faintly in the brushed metal doors. When they opened, she stepped inside alone, the quiet wrapping around her again, familiar but different from the night before. The doors closed, and the elevator began its descent, each floor passing with a soft chime that no longer felt like a boundary between worlds, but a connection between them. Upstairs and downstairs were no longer separate in the same way. They were part of the same structure, the same system, just seen from different places. When the doors opened to the lower level, the air shifted again, warmer, less controlled, carrying the scent of cleaning supplies and quiet effort. Naomi stepped out, moving down the corridor she knew by memory, each step grounded, unchanged. The service closet door stood slightly open, and inside, Marcus leaned against the counter, organizing supplies with slow, methodical movements. He looked up as she entered, his expression searching her face for something he could not quite name. So, he asked, the words simple, but carrying everything he had not seen. Naomi placed the folder she still carried gently on the counter, her fingers resting on it for a brief second before letting go. Work, she said. Marcus raised an eyebrow slightly, then let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh. That is it, he asked. Naomi met his eyes, her expression calm, steady. That is enough, she replied. The answer settled into the small room, not dismissing what had happened, but placing it in its proper place. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding more than the words themselves. He glanced at the folder, then back at her. Things are different up there now, he said. Naomi followed his gaze briefly, then looked back at him. They always were, she said. We just see it now. Marcus leaned back slightly, absorbing that, then nodded again, this time with a quiet certainty. Naomi reached for a clean cloth from the shelf, folding it once, then again, her hands moving with the same precision they always had. She placed it on the cart, adjusting it until the edges aligned perfectly. The motion was small, almost invisible, but it carried the same care she had brought into every room, every space, every moment. Outside, the building continued. Meetings would happen. Decisions would be made. People would move through the same hallways, sit at the same tables, speak the same words. But something had shifted, not in the structure, but in the way it was seen. Naomi stepped back into the hallway, guiding the cart forward, her steps steady, her presence quiet but undeniable. The lights reflected off the polished floor, stretching ahead of her in long, clean lines. She did not rush. She did not pause. She simply moved forward the same way she always had. But now, the space around her moved with her, not around her. And somewhere above, in a room filled with glass and silence, a man stood alone for a moment longer than usual, looking out at the city, not with control, but with understanding. Naomi Carter had not taken anything from him. She had not broken the system. She had not forced the change. She had simply stood where she was, seen what others ignored, and refused to pretend it was not there. And that was enough.